Greetings to all C3RF members and friends across Canada, indeed around the world, and a special welcome to the folks at Veterans for Freedom on their dedicated streaming channels as I view this video summary of the C3RF update for 27 June 2025. The title of this update is Canada Last, and it begins by noting that Gordon Lightfoot's magnum opus ballad, Canadian Railroad Trilogy, stated that there was a time in this fair land when things were very different. The song would pinpoint this difference as that between a pristine and unpopulated landscape with one full of hammers swinging in the bright blazing sun. Such was the case as Canadians toiled to overcome epic natural obstacles in order to bring goods to a young growing land from sea to sea. It is interesting, given the current legacy media's inclination to pigeonhole patriotism as a form of white supremacy, that the song was commissioned by the CBC in the nation's centennial year of 1967. And so it is we see a present-day Canada that has departed from a well-deserved sense of pride over sacrifices and progress made over a century's worth of effort to become a post-national state ashamed of its systemic racism and religious discrimination. And so it is as well that Canada has moved away from a day and age when ministerial responsibility was one of multiple checks and balances on the powers of a representative democracy. The concept, deeply embedded in the British parliamentary system, bequeathed to Canada, maintains that ministers of the Crown are, quote, constitutionally responsible for the provision and conduct of government, unquote. And it is they who, quote, in the ultimate, must personally answer to Parliament and thence the electorate for their actions and the actions of their subordinates, unquote. At the end of the day, it is the minister, not the office, who is responsible, and it is this that vests in each minister the unique constitutional responsibility for the use of power. This understanding, in conjunction with a judicial system that operated in accordance with long-standing common law traditions, was quite capable of operating as a brake on government overreach and preserved the legacy of a Magna Carta that assured freemen were worthy of respect, dignity, and due process. The fact that the concept of ministerial responsibility was a core component of parliamentary accountability before our centennial year is evidenced in the Lucien Cardin and Guy Favreau instances in 1967 and 65, respectively. Both gentlemen were Liberal ministers of justice who were perceived to have embarrassed their governments through their own mistaken actions. Cardin would distinguish himself by inappropriately outing a Conservative colleague alleged to be connected with the Munsinger affair, while Favreau fell afoul of the due process rights of an alleged drug dealer. In both cases, the ministers would do the honorable thing and make themselves accountable by resigning from their cabinet positions. Mistakes were made and mistakes were owned up to in this bygone era. One would have to look long and hard to find examples of such accountability on the political scene of today's Canada. A check on the historical records indicates that the concept of ministerial responsibility in the post-centennial era, at any rate, has been replaced by the concept of the 3 Ds. These Ds, in the form of deny, deflect, and diffuse, are commonplace in today's political scene as high-power politicians brazenly and cynically skirt any requirement to be accountable for their mistakes. Even if one places the 3 Ds aside, Canadians have still been witness to the inappropriate use of ministerial responsibility for cynical political purposes. Such was the case with Bev Oda and, arguably, Chrystia Freeland. In the former case, Conservative Cabinet Minister Oda was chased down relentlessly by a Liberal-friendly establishment media that sensed blood in the water over the misuse of public funds to buy a $16 orange juice. In the latter case, citizens saw Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland resign mere days before the December 2024 presentation of a Liberal Party fall economic update. She deemed the related $60 billion deficit as unsupportable and couldn't go along with, quote, such irresponsible borrowing and spending, unquote. Then again, there were those who insisted that this was not the real reason for her departure from cabinet, but rather it was her peak at being replaced by one Mark Carney immediately after she tabled the economic update. This later explanation holds water given the fact that Freeland, now in a newly minted Carney cabinet, has little to say over the proposed spending of $500 billion that would plunge Canada, quote, further into debt and deficits than Justin Trudeau was planning on, unquote. In both the Oda and Freeland resignation sagas, Canadians can be forgiven for feeling that their intelligence was insulted. By way of using denial, deflection, and diffusion as a means of escaping accountability, ruling class responses to the court ruling against the invocation of the Emergencies Act, authoritative claims of mRNA vaccine harm, and the designation of Canada as a hotbed of transnational drug trafficking and money laundering spring to mind. No heads rolled, for example, when federal Judge Mosley found the invocation of the Emergencies Act to be anti-constitutional as it breached Charter Section 2B, speech, and 8, search and seizure rights of Canadians. Such claims were denied immediately, even as first-hand claims of vaccine damage were deflected by blithely declaring that misinformation was the real problem. In the case of Canada's alleged central role in cartel triad drug trafficking and money laundering, the whole concept would be diffused by lamely asserting that Canada was, quote, responsible for only 1% of the fentanyl entering the United States, unquote. The problem with accountability being lost in a cloud of denial, deflection, and diffusion at the ministerial level is that the public writ large loses its expectation of being safeguarded from arbitrary and capricious actions. It goes without saying that the loss of this expectation sounds the death knell of public trust that is central to the creation of truly responsive and responsible public agencies. And so we see the Liberal government's denial of stripping Freedom Convoy 2022 participants and their financial donors of their charter rights lead to confusion and bitterness as the public sees the same government ignoring violence and vandalism perpetrated by, apparently, preferred identity groups. How could we the people trust a government that stood by as the minister responsible for the martial law travesty left politics without acknowledging his former department's overreach? Certainly, such a situational application of civil liberties makes a joke of Canada's cherished rule of law. Then we have the plethora of reports on the ruinous side effects associated with the not-so-safe and effective Wuhan virus vaccines. Such reports have been religiously stiff-armed and deflected by Canadian public health authorities as nothing but misinformation. Of course, no explanation in the way of solid data-based evidence is presented to support such an assertion, even as the evidence piles up on the side of those who allegedly misinform. Lacking any accountability for what citizens clearly see with their own eyes, it is only natural that they should lose trust in the medical and public health authorities that ply them with narratives over facts. And so it is that we see the rise of a heretofore non-existent vaccine hesitancy, even as Canadians perceive the abuse of the medical assistance in dying policies, with troublesome veterans and long-term inpatients being offered an early death. Forget about Hippocratic Oath and Canadians First. It's like they are last with no accountability on the horizon. In the case of American claims that a Canadian transnational fentanyl and money laundering justified tariffs on an emergency basis, FBI Director Kash Patel blew the doors off of Canada's efforts to defuse the problem as minuscule. He did so during an interview with Joe Rogan in mid-May 2025, in which he stated that, quote, Mexican cartels, Chinese Communist Party operatives, and Iranian threat actors have forged a new axis of criminal cooperation using Canada's porous northern border and the Port of Vancouver to flood fentanyl and terror suspects into the United States, unquote. To make matters worse, reportage by retired senior RCMP officer Gary Clement chronicles an RCMP that has consistently demonstrated systemic shortcomings in dealing with this transnational challenge as its toxic leadership evades accountability. Rather than address these serious security failures, the Canadian government has responded to American concerns through a Bill C2 that uses the crisis to deprive citizens of their privacy and due process rights, even as it restricts their cash transactions. Yet again, Canada and Canadians come last as a cynical government is seen to take advantage of a crisis to crush civil liberties. In closing, a reminder to join us at CanadianCitizens.org, where you can see this update in its full glory, including links to all of these cited documents. Simply go to the News tab at the top of the page and select C3RF Member Updates from its drop-down menu. Until next time, this is Russ Cooper signing off, wishing you and yours much happiness and freedom from C3RF.